Okay, so verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" All right, so Jesus, no stranger to controversy, seems to garner some everywhere he goes, and he does this in this section today as well. His disciples and himself, they are walking through a field on a Sabbath, and they are picking the heads of grain, and they are eating the seeds as they walk along. And so this would be regarded as somewhat of a serious infraction on the law in terms of keeping the Sabbath. Now, for the Jewish people, even modern practicing Jews, the Sabbath is very, very, very important. I mean, it's important to Christians as well, but it's important in the sense to the ancient Israelites and to modern Jews today. It's one of the most unique elements to their faith. One of the most unique practices in Judaism is the Sabbath. So it's no surprise that the religious leaders take very, very seriously the Sabbath. And if you don't know, the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 20 is given to us as, I think it's the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. If I'm wrong, forgive me about that. So the Sabbath is other than circumcision to the Jewish people, is what sets them apart from other religions, other nations. No other group instituted something like this, like a day set apart during the week, not just for rest, but a day to honor God. And so the general idea of the Sabbath is that you set aside the things of the activities that you would pursue regularly throughout the week that would provide you an income, perhaps. Or if you were a farmer, right, you would put down your farming elements, your tools that you would, sow seeds or plow the fields. You take your hands off the plow and let everything rest for a day. Now, the Sabbath has a number of different elements, and we're going to go a little more into it next week as well. But the Sabbath is a day to honor God. And what that looks like is, God, it's an admission that God is in control. And so when you practice the Sabbath, what you are essentially saying is, God, you're in control of this anyway, and I'm gonna honor you by not working. And it really is an honor to God, because God is the one who's in control. God is the one who is your provider, whether you recognize it or not. What the good news, too, is that Sabbath is a day of rest. It is a day where you can be refreshed. It's a good thing. And the Sabbath really is a good thing. But as we will see in our text today, the Sabbath can, unfortunately, become something else. It could become not a blessing, but rather a burden, or at times it could very well be a burden. James Brooks says, in the Old Testament forbade work on the Sabbath, and the scribes enumerated 39 kinds of work that were prohibited. So I want to give you kind of a little snapshot into the Jewish mindset when it comes to the Sabbath. And so there are 39 categories of work to be avoided that the scribes enumerated to the Jewish people in Jesus' day. It's also true for today. There are 39 activities to be avoided, and this is all spelled out in what's called the melechot, and there are 39 categories here. And so I'm going to highlight 3 of them for you, just so we can kind of get a better understanding of the Sabbath and what it means to the Jewish people. And so this is true back then, and this is also true today. So the first of the melechot, the elements that we are to avoid, or the Jewish people are to avoid, the first one would be carrying a burden. Now, this is kind of one of the quintessential things to avoid when you are practicing the Sabbath, the day of rest. You are to avoid carrying something, carrying a burden, because when you are carrying something, when you think about it, you are generally in the process of either making a deal, making money, perhaps you are moving inventory somewhere. There's a lot of reasons why carrying something kind of helps us understand that that's a type of work that benefits you, perhaps financially. So, translated to our modern day, practicing Jews would not carry a purse on the Sabbath, a wallet, a set of keys. Those are all considered to be burdens, and you would just refrain from carrying anything like that on the Sabbath. In John chapter 5, Jesus, if you remember, Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and by the healing pool, there's a crippled man whom Jesus heals. And what does Jesus tell him? He tells him to pick up his mat and go home, essentially. And so the religious leaders of the day, that's what their issue was. Their issue was that he was carrying something, which would be a clear violation of the melachot. And he was walking home, and the religious leaders called him out. They said, "This is the Sabbath. The law forbids you to carry your mat." That's the context of this story here. Now, of course, the criticism would be that the religious leaders seemed to not take any notice that this man who was crippled for his life was now walking, right? So you can kind of see a glimpse here how quickly the melachot, the items that surround the Sabbath to help us protect the Sabbath, become something it wasn't intended to. It wasn't intended to become. They didn't praise God because all they could see was the man carrying his mat. Okay, so the first one is carrying a burden. The second one is reaping. This one kind of makes sense, and this applies to our text today. Reaping would be anything like cutting down the plants that you are growing in your fields or whatever. And so that would make sense, not to take a sickle and slice down the wheat or whatever. That would be definitely considered work. But the disciples of Jesus were walking along, and as they were going, they would pick heads of grain out, and they would rub the heads of grain, separating the chaff or the non-edible portions of the wheat, and they would pick out the seeds and they would eat them. Now you might think to yourself, well, if this is how I feel about it, well, that's hardly work, right? They're not selling the things that they're picking. And the Bible clearly says that in Deuteronomy 23, picking a little grain by hand from a neighbor's field, that's legal. That's something that you are free to do. When I was a kid, growing up in the mountains, we didn't have a lot of produce. Colorado's not really known for produce. No one grew tomatoes, right, where I grew up. The one thing we did have, though, was raspberry bushes. And one of my favorite memories is going kind of hiking through the woods and finding these great big raspberry bushes, and we pick berries, with my parents. And it was just so much fun. It was a task of enjoyment. And we'd pick berries, we'd eat them, we'd put them in a bowl, and we'd put them on our Cheerios the next morning. It was delightful. Hardly work, right? That was something that gave us life, which is really what the Sabbath is about, and it wasn't considered work. Now, the Jewish people in Jesus' day would have considered picking grain as a clear violation of the Sabbath. So the problem here, Jesus, of course, never says that the Sabbath is wrong, right? He doesn't say it's silly, and I don't think we need to have that perspective either. I don't think we need to say the Sabbath is silly. Obviously, it's not. Exodus 34:21 says, 6 days you shall work, but you shall rest on the seventh. In plowing and harvesting you shall rest. The problem is the addition to the Sabbath. That's where the problems come in. Now, you can put yourself in a position to not work, though, and that's not a bad thing. Okay, and so that's essentially what the Jewish people are doing. They're safeguarding the Sabbath. With these 39 categories, they are safeguarding what they would consider a quintessential part of being a follower of God. Now, we do that too, I think, in some ways. My wife, for instance, Leah and I, we have 2 different rest days. It's just our seasonal life. Our seasonal life is crazy. So I try to rest as much as I can on Friday, and then my wife tries to rest as much as she can on Sunday. And what my wife does, one of the things she does, since she does design work on her computer, she just doesn't go on her computer. That would be a safeguard, right? And so that's not totally dissimilar from what the Jewish leaders were doing, right? They were protecting the Sabbath. So I don't know if we necessarily have to fault them for that. However, it would be a mistake to have Pastor Matt come up here and say, do not go on the computer. Like that is not something, and if you do, you're in violation of the Sabbath. That's kind of the difference there, okay? So picking heads of grain would have been a violation of the Sabbath, and Jesus and his disciples were violating it. But of course, it wasn't the Sabbath that God ordained. It was something that was added to. And the last, so I had, the first one I had was carrying a burden. The second one is reaping. And the third one, and I'm just adding this one because it's really interesting, is burning. Okay, in Exodus chapter 35, it says, "You shall not light a fire at home on the Sabbath day." All right, so in our modern day, the Jewish people don't light a fire. They didn't light a fire back then. But today, it's kind of interesting because there are a lot of things that create a type of flame that would be put into this category. Like, for instance, a combustible engine. You wouldn't drive a car on the Sabbath because there's a fire that's going on in the, or combustion that's going on in your engine. What was interesting to me was, I don't know if you've ever celebrated a Shabbat, which it's the Hebrew Sabbath, with someone who was practicing. If you've ever celebrated one, you'll notice in their home, you'll see light switches taped over. And so the day before the Sabbath, modern Jews will put a little piece of tape over their light switches. And the reason why they do that is to protect them from inadvertently turning on a light, right? Because you kind of have muscle memory. You could turn on a light on and off pretty easily without thinking about it. And so what they're doing here is, when you think about a light bulb has a little filament in it, a metal filament, and it heats up. It's very hot. And so that's considered as starting a fire, because you're using energy to create something with a lot of heat. And that's why modern Jews won't turn on a light bulb when they are practicing the Sabbath. So my point here is, I just wanted to highlight some of these things to you, not because I want us to conclude that, oh my gosh, I can't believe they went that far with practicing the Sabbath. That's not my conclusion here, and I don't think that should be our conclusion, but rather we need to put ourselves in the story. What is it about us that we could very easily create traditions or create safeguards that become more important than the actual law, right? We can do this all the time. And I was thinking about this too, like our evangelical Christian culture is really interesting sometimes, right? Because there are some Christians who are very much into like popular culture, right? Now, is that a wrong thing? If you were a Christian who doesn't really listen to something like Christian music, is that wrong? Is that sinful? Right? But so we can see how we can kind of have an attitude about certain people who do things maybe a little differently than we do in our own like Christian culture. So let's look at it that way. I think that's a good way to do it. We can learn from the Jewish people and their own mistakes. So, all right, so let's keep moving on here. So verse 25. All right, here's where it gets really fun today. Verse 25, Jesus, it says, Jesus answered, Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. All right, so Jesus, by way of argument, is referencing something that David did in the book of 1 Samuel. Now, anytime Jesus references David, it's kind of like it's putting really the argument right in the face of the Pharisees, because the Pharisees and the Jewish people love David, right? David is a hero. That's why David is kind of like the foreshadow of the coming Messiah. David was a Messiah figure because he built the kingdom of Israel. And the Jewish people were waiting for the next Messiah to come and do the same thing again. So David is a great way for Jesus to argue. So what David does in 1 Samuel chapter 21 is he's running away from Saul, if you remember the story. Saul is the king. He doesn't like David. He's jealous of David, and David is convinced finally that his life is in danger. So David runs away, and he runs to this city called Nob, N-O-B, the town of Nob. And at the town of Nob is the Tabernacle. The Tabernacle, if you don't know, is the, you don't have to put it up yet, Cherry, is the precursor to the temple. The Tabernacle is a small version of the temple that is mobile. They can move it around, and this was used before they built the actual physical temple itself. So David goes to Nob, to the Tabernacle, and he asks for the bread. It's called the consecrated bread, also referred to as show bread, or the bread of presentation. He wasn't supposed to eat it, but the priest there gives it to him to eat. All right, so let's talk about this. We have a picture of the show bread here. And so this would be found inside the tabernacle. And there were 12 loaves that were presented and made every single week, and were placed inside it's called the holy place of the tabernacle. Can you do the next picture, please? And the next picture, so we have this kind of cross reference here of what the tabernacle would look like. So there's the inner room, which would be called the Holy of Holies, and we reference that frequently. The Holy of Holies housed the Ark of the Covenant, and that would be where the presence of God would reside, only to be entered once a year by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Now, outside of the Holy of Holies is a separate, larger room called the Holy Place. Inside the Holy Place carried other elements of Jewish worship. On the north side of the building, you see there is the lampstand, the seven-branched lampstand, also called a menorah. And on the south side would be the table of the presence, the bread of the presence. And the bread of the presence is really interesting because if you, historically speaking, in other temples, pagan religions would also bring food into the temple. But the idea when they brought the food into the temple was to, quote-unquote, feed the gods. And so the Jewish people aren't feeding God when they place the 12 loaves of bread in the holy place. Rather, what they are doing is they are using it. It is being used as an illustration of what God is doing in the lives of the people of Israel. You have the menorah, which is the light of the world. It represents the light of the world that's dark in there. God is the light. God is also the bread. So as much as you need bread every day, you need God even more. That's the idea. And of course, that's a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. He calls himself what? The bread of life. And we're going to take communion later on today. We're going to take the bread, which represents the body of Jesus Christ himself. So that bread is very special. It represents God's faithfulness to his people. It also represents a posture of thanksgiving on behalf of the people of Israel to God. Thankful to God. Okay. So David and his men, they take the bread. That would have been a clear violation of the law that was stipulated in the book of Leviticus. So Jesus is using that as an argument. Look, if what David did was okay, then what we are doing now is even more okay, and I'll explain what that means here in a second. All right, so now we come to an apologetic question. All right, so there's a textual issue with this text here, and I'm going to get a little deep. I'm going to try not to get too deep here, okay? I ran into this past week, and this was just fascinating to me. I actually spent I tried to count maybe 15 hours on just this one question I'm about to address here. I talked to two Greek professors from Bethel and a couple other people, a couple other resources to figure this thing out. And so let's go into it. So verse 26, it says this. In the NIV, it says, "In the days of Abiathar, the high priest." Can you go to the next slide, please? So here's the top line there is the Greek version of that line. Epi, Abiathar, Archarios. If you take that verse out just on its own, it's translated as when Abiathar was high priest. That's different than the NIV translation, if you guys can tell. I'd say about half the translations translated this way: when Abiathar was high priest. Now, here's the issue with that, okay? And this is why a lot of scholars and people who study the Bible, study the Greek, we study it because of issues like this. Questions. I shouldn't say issue, it's a question that we want to figure out. Here's the issue. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, when David gets the bread, Abiathar is not the high priest. All right, if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 21, David interacts with the high priest. Who is the high priest? The high priest is a man by the name of Ahimelech. Can you show me the next picture, please? So Jesus references Abiathar in the story of David in the Consecrated Bread. Next slide, please. But it's Ahimelech who is the high priest who actually gives David the bread. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's going on here? We have two characters that seem to be in conflict, and this is why I'm going into it, right? The reason why I'm going into it is because if you do a cursory reading of the text, you might quickly conclude what? Jesus is wrong. Wait, hold on. Jesus is referencing a high priest that wasn't the high priest when David took the bread. I can't trust the Bible anymore. That is very often a conclusion that someone would make when they come to a textual question like this. So, I want to talk about it, guys, because I don't want us to be afraid of these types of things. Especially for you younger Christians who might not have ever interacted with the scripture in a kind of focused way like this. This can be something that could actually really rock your faith, and I don't want it to rock your faith. All right, so let's talk about it. What is going on here? A cursory, like an overview here, would be that Jesus references Abiathar, but really it's Ahimelech who gives David the bread. Now here's the relationship between Abiathar and Ahimelech. Abiathar is the son of Ahimelech, okay? Abiathar is the son of Ahimelech. And he's not referenced until 1 Samuel chapter 22, okay? What makes this a little more confusing, hopefully this doesn't take us completely out of it, is the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospels of Luke have the same story that Mark is referencing, but both Matthew and Luke don't discuss the identity of the high priest who gave David the bread. So that kind of makes people go, well, why did Matthew and Luke reference Abiathar and they just kind of left it open? Some people say, well, they're trying to correct something that Mark made a mistake in doing. So what's going on here? Was Jesus incorrect? Did Mark make a mistake in his translation? Did Peter remember incorrectly what Jesus was teaching? And so again, let's not jump to a conclusion that obviously there's something wrong here with the text, but rather let's take a step back and at least, at a minimum, we can admit that our modern view of how stories are told and how we reference text is probably a lot different than how they did it in the ancient world. Okay? So our first conclusion is potentially that Jesus was wrong. And a lot of people jump to that conclusion very quickly, or the text is incorrect, it was, along the way someone made a mistake, whatever. The second possibility is that Jesus knew exactly what he was saying, and he did it for a specific purpose. Now the question is, what is that purpose? Okay, so why would Jesus refer to Abiathar rather than Ahimelech? Now, one possibility is that Abiathar is the more well-known of the two. So Abiathar, if you know the story of David and his relationship to Abiathar, he becomes the high priest underneath David himself. So Ahimelech only is around during the time of David when he gets the bread. But Abiathar joins David, and Abiathar eventually becomes the main high priest underneath David. So the argument is, God is doing something new, not only with the kingship of Saul, but he's also doing something new with the high priest. And the new high priest is the legitimate high priest because David is the legitimate king. Abiathar is David's high priest. That's one potential conclusion we can make. Another potential conclusion is that Jesus is referencing a general time frame. That time, when Abiathar was alive, right? Abiathar, it's not like these two individuals were separate by, decades, right? They were alive together. They were father and son. And so Jesus very easily could have just been referencing the lifetime of Abiathar, who eventually becomes the high priest. And that's why our translation, the NIV, says, in the days of Abiathar. That's why it translates it that way. Another option, and here's where it got really interesting. I was chatting with Professor Lynn Nixon, whom I had never met before. I wrote her this question. Okay, I'm struggling with this text. Can you chat with me? And so we had a Zoom meeting yesterday, and it was great. She's a professor at Bethel, but she lives in Arizona, I believe. And we went over some of the potential options that we have before us. She made the point, and I didn't know this, she made the point that even in the New Testament, there are times when there are two high priests that are working. Now see, I didn't know that. There are two high priests that work simultaneously, but they're not equal. One high priest would be the actual high priest, and the second high priest would be like the high priest in training. Okay? But they're both at times referenced as the high priest. And furthermore, the high priest position very often falls within family lines. So if your father is the high priest and you're the eldest son, chances are very good that you will become the next high priest. It's not true across the board, but very often we think of Aaron, right? Aaron and his sons. Aaron was the high priest, and guess who became the high priest after Aaron, right? Eli is the same way, I think. So that's another option. So when Jesus is, and I think this is my favorite explanation, I think this makes the most sense to me, is that when Jesus is referencing the high priest Abiathar, he's referencing the fact that he was the high priest elect. Does that make sense? And he would have always been referred to as a high priest, in other words, okay? There are a couple other things we can go really deep, but we're not going to. And then finally, can you go back to that first Greek slide, please? And finally, this will be my last point here. That first word is epsilon, p, and iota. That's epi. That's a preposition right there. And a preposition that highlights something that takes place in the past. And Lynn Nixon, my Greek professor that helped me out, she told me that very often when it's used in this context, it's pointing to a general time frame rather than a specific point. So it's like when someone asks me for my birthday, I will tell them specifically my birthday, 9/21/82. Put that in your calendars. 9/21/82. That's my birthday. But when someone asks like what decade I was born in, I'll just say I was born in the 80s. Not proud of it. It's just when I was born. Okay, that's a much more general time frame, right? You don't think of a specific day; you think of a decade. And so that's how that preposition is used here. So all in all, I think people tend to jump to, there's something really wrong with the text. And I think oftentimes we get great explanations if we just dig a little deeper. And sometimes, now am I totally right about this? I think I've got a pretty good understanding of it, but am I 100% sure that's precisely what happened? I don't think I can say that, right? My understanding of this text isn't 100% complete, and that's going to be true for a number of texts. But I don't want us to be afraid of going deep at times, and I think that should be an encouragement to us that when we come to the Bible, sometimes it's not going to line up the way we want it to, but let's remember that's not what the text is designed to do. Really, that's more about my own expectations rather than what the Bible is trying to alert us to understand. Okay, so let's be bold. Let's go into it, and let's jump into it without fear. Okay, moving on. Any questions? That was kind of like a lecture kind of piece. Any? All right, cool. Verse 27. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. All right, this is a famous phrase that Jesus says. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What is the heart of the Sabbath? Is it a burden or is it a blessing? And it's a beautiful way to look at it. And we can see in other areas of our lives where we take something that's good and pure and maybe even holy and we turn it into something else because of cynicism, because of stress, because of a whole host of different reasons. Occasionally, I've never watched a whole episode, but I've seen Gordon Ramsay. Do you guys know who Gordon Ramsay is? He's this chef guy that is he's intense. He's a nut. I don't know how else to say it. But it's fascinating because Gordon Ramsay, he goes into these restaurants. I don't know why they invite him in. But he goes into these restaurants and he judges them based on, quality of food, freshness of produce, and really the cleanliness of, the kitchen in the restaurant. And it's a very entertaining show because he goes in there and he just tears these people apart. I want to say I feel bad for these people, but actually he's right. I mean, don't ever watch this show if you're about to eat a meal, right? Because it'll make you not want to eat anything. And I highlight this because every person who becomes a chef or who wants to own a restaurant, every person at one point was interested in that. Why? Because they like people. They love people. And they love food. And they can bring good food so people can enjoy it. That's the heart of a restaurant. Or at least I hope that's the heart of a restaurant. Because if you make the best food in the world and no one can enjoy it, so what? You have to have people there to enjoy the food. Somewhere along the line, these restaurant owners and these cooks lose their heart for people. And it becomes about maybe survival. And I'm sure it's an extremely stressful, that would be a really tough, well, especially during COVID, that would be an incredibly, exceptionally difficult business to run. But somewhere along the line, things change. You don't care quite as much. You start cutting corners. And we can see how that can work in our own field of business, or even maybe with our own family. We can get, it's just not worth it. I'm not going to try as hard anymore. And that's, I think, a picture of what the Sabbath can be, right? It's not about the rules surrounding protecting the Sabbath. It's about good for others, good for them. And here's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 12. He says, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, Jesus says, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That's a beautiful turn of phrase. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Verse 28, Jesus says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, talk about a phrase that is ripe with controversy. We've already talked about Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man. Remember, that's an image that we're supposed to remember from back in Daniel chapter 7. The Son of Man is the only human that can approach God, the Ancient of Days, on his throne. Jesus is saying, that is me. The vision of Daniel takes place in the future. Jesus is saying, that is me. I am the Son of Man. He says, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Whoa. Hold on. Let's think about that for a second. When does God institute the Sabbath? I referenced the Ten Commandments, but that's not when it started. Genesis chapter 1. The seventh day, God instituted the Sabbath. God, in creation, wrote the Sabbath in. And God himself follows the Sabbath in that context. So it's, on some levels we can understand how people can be so filled with pride. They have these, delusions of grandeur, like Nebuchadnezzar when he's standing on his castle and he's looking out over his kingdom and he says, look what I did, right? I can see some crazy people doing that. But when Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, it's like someone standing on a mountain and saying, look at the sun, I created that. Look at the planets, I created those. Look at the universe, I brought this into being. Jesus is making the claim that he himself is the one who instituted the Sabbath. If he is the Lord of the Sabbath, he is in control of the Sabbath. And the Sabbath listens to his voice and the voice of no other. Who created the Sabbath? Jesus did. Who maintains the Sabbath? Jesus does. And essentially Jesus is saying, I gave you the Sabbath. I'm the author of it. So I get to define it, essentially is what Jesus is saying. And now the question is, did they really, grasp precisely what he was saying? I think they might have, because very soon they start plotting his murder. Very soon they start doing that quickly. There's that But this is a big claim of Jesus Christ, right? There's that classic, I think it's John Stott who makes the observation. Either Jesus was lying, he was crazy, or he's telling the truth, right? I'm sure most of us have heard that phrase. I love that phrase, but this is a great example. Jesus is saying he created, that's like someone saying, I created Wednesday. Yeah, that was me. You like your Wednesday? I made that. Like, what? That doesn't make sense. That's what Jesus is saying. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. So either he's lying, here's the rationale behind that. Either he's lying, and if he's lying, then we certainly shouldn't follow someone who's lying. Or he's crazy town. I don't know about you, but I don't want to follow a crazy person. Or he's telling the truth. We don't have another option there. Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And now we're going to move into a time of communion.